Let's take some questions from them. We've had emailers who have heard the show on previous weeks, and they've emailed some questions to see if their system can help you. Here are a couple of the questions. First of all, number one is, my son has just been diagnosed with an ACL tear, which requires surgery. Can your system help?
Yes. The first thing we'd have to do, though, is identify what that tear is. If it is a mid-substance rupture, which means that the tendon is torn right in half, then surgery is 100% indicated. If it is a slight tear, if it's a strain, if it's a fray, any of those things where it's not a complete middle rupture, we can definitely prevent that surgery in about 80% of the time. We'll know very quickly in the evaluation process, and the first thing that we would do basically is give them a test to determine, is the force being absorbed by the muscles above the ACL? Understand, the ACL is not the problem. The problem is the muscle either above it or below it, which did not do its job. That force then goes directly into the ACL, and obviously it's not designed to absorb that force, so it tears.
Let's go to question number two. A listener writes, I've been diagnosed as a bone-on-bone and been told I need a new hip. What can your system do for me? Can you help that?
Yes, that's a very simple one. And again, the bone-on-bone is a symptom. It is not the origin of the problem. So, as an example, we had a person come into the clinic today who has been diagnosed bone-on-bone, and this is the second time he's had this. So he had bone-on-bone on the right knee, and he got a new knee there. He's now got bone-on-bone on the left knee, and we're telling him, don't do the surgery. Here's why. Again, what failed? Not where it failed, what failed. And what failed was the muscles above that joint. So think of those muscles as a shock absorber, and if you take that shock absorber away, all that force and shock has to go into the patella. And as it goes into the patella or the kneecap, it just keeps on irritating and compressing, and the cartilage, which acts as a shock absorber, also is now completely compressed, and so now you're bone-on-bone. So you go out and get a brand new knee, that doesn't solve the problem. That solves the symptom, but 10 years later, you're going to have exactly the same thing, only with a artificial joint. You're going to have a worn-out artificial joint. Why? Because the problem was the muscle not doing its job, not the joint absorbing the force.
How did the muscle not do its job in the first place? How does that happen?
Well, in this case, as an example, fascinating question you asked me that. This case, it started from an ankle sprain, where the ankle sprain created what we call a unstable ankle, because there's just a tiny ligament that holds the tibia fibula together, and when you have a sprain, it stretches that ligament, and when it stretches that ligament, it breaks down that electrical energy that's now coming up into the muscle. So you've reduced the amount of electrical energy coming into that muscle, or information. So sooner or later, that muscle no longer does its job. It's not getting enough stimulus to do its job. So when that happens, all that force that's supposed to be absorbed by that muscle now goes directly to the joint. The joint's not designed to absorb that force, and so consequently you're going to have a problem. And it's going to be a long-term situation before it gets to bone-on-bone, and it's 100% accurate to say it is a wear and tear. But why? That question is never, ever answered. The why is the muscle didn't do its job. If I took your shocks off your car, you're not going to throw your car away. You're going to put new shocks on. So why in the world would you buy a new car or a new joint when you can just put new shocks on?
Third question. I've been told by my orthopedic surgeon that I need a knee replacement. What can your system do for me?
Again, the same scenario. Anytime we have a joint problem, it is not the joint that is the problem. It is the muscle that's not supporting the joint that's the problem. So if all we're ever doing is working on where the problem ended up, we're really never resolving the issue. What we do in the clinic is we identify what muscles did not do their job, what damage was caused by not doing its job, clean up the damage caused by it not doing its job, and the problem is solved, and it never comes back.
It's the voice of Dennis Thompson. He is the founder of the ARP Wave System. His clinic is located in Burnsville, corporate offices in Apple Valley. This is the House of Pain, heard Sunday mornings here at 7 o'clock. I'm the common man, Dan Cole. If you have questions for Dennis, you can email them to him at arpwave.com, or if you just want to find out more about the ARP Wave Clinic, you can do the same thing, or you can call 952-431-9708. Our fourth question, listener writes, I just had surgery and was told it would be 6 to 9 months before I could resume my active lifestyle. What can your system do for me?
Well, we can dramatically shorten that, but let's talk about why. And again, the traditional way that we deal with soft tissue injury, or the traditional way that we deal with post-rehabilitation of surgical intervention, is the first step is rest, ice, compression, and elevation. So we put ice on it, we manifest the symptoms to reduce the swelling, and we numb the symptoms. Then once we do that, then we go to joint mobility. Well, the rest, ice, compression, elevation side of that equation might take 3 or 4 weeks. Then we go to joint mobility. That might take another 3 or 4 to 5 weeks. Then we go to functional strength, where we're doing rubber bands and balls and balance beams and all this other stuff. That might take another 4 to 6 weeks. And then finally we get around to what I consider the number one problem, and that's the compensation pattern. So, Dan, anybody you've ever known who's had an injury, they still have the compensation pattern. They still have it. Now, why do they have it? Is because 16 to 18 weeks of ingraining that pattern into your lifestyle, you're not going to get rid of it in physical therapy. It's just not going to happen. So what we do is I created a system by which we move the compensation pattern right to the head of the list and simultaneously work on the rest, ice, compression, elevation side, simultaneously work on joint mobility, simultaneously work on strengthening. And when I talk about strengthening, we already discussed it earlier today, and that was we're able to contract the muscle at 500 times a second, where a normal therapy session is 2 contractions per second. So consequently, we're going to get a lot of strength work done in a very, very short period of time. And because of that, we're going to dramatically reduce the amount of time it takes for you to return to activity. The unfortunate part about that is the history of all injury is based on 50, 60-year-old data. So 50 to 60 years ago, a doctor figured out it took 9 months to recover from a surgical intervention. Okay, but the only way you return to play or return to active lifestyle is you got to pass a functional test. Our people will pass that functional test in 5.5 to 6 weeks, not 9 months. That's how we could help them.